My name's Kirsty. I'm the Executive European Editor at Vogue Business, and sustainability is a big pillar of our content focus. Delighted to be here with this panel today. We've got a lot to try and fit into 35 minutes. We'll do our best. I'm going to hand over to Jules fairly quickly because she is going to do an excellent scene setter, so I won't steal her thunder. But just to say, to date, I think efforts to tackle the climate crisis have focused quite a bit on the kind of transition to more renewable energy rather than necessarily, as James was saying, focusing on production. So part of the challenge is that it can be hard to measure the impact, right, of some of these circular solutions and business models on emissions specifically. So in this discussion, we're going to find out how some of the brands and retailers are approaching circularity, what stage they're at on that journey, and unpack the link between what they're doing in circularity and emissions reduction. And then also talk about how we can kind of strengthen that link and make that message very clear to the public, to government. So, Jules, I'm going to come to you to kick us off. Ellen MacArthur Foundation has done a lot of research on this topic. So why, first of all, is it so important for fashion to move to more circular business models, just as a brief sort of scene setter?
Okay, let's go back before we go forward. So yeah, I mean, as you heard from James, what's really interesting is often at the foundation we get asked by businesses in our network, should we take circular economy action or should we take climate change action? And actually, I mean, that's a fine question to ask, but it's not really one or the other. It's an and, because ultimately by design, the circular economy is a system solution framework that's designed to help tackle climate change and biodiversity loss and waste and pollution. And today, a lot of the efforts that have been taken to make progress towards net zero focus on securing the energy transition, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and that is incredibly important and it needs to continue. But our research shows that that will only account for about 55% of the emissions reduction necessary. The remainder, that 45% of emissions, is going to come from how we produce cars, clothes, food, effectively the products in our everyday life. So as we transition to net zero, the circular economy can help in completing that picture. In a circular economy, we eliminate waste and pollution, we circulate products and materials, and we regenerate nature. So by eliminating waste and pollution, we can reduce emissions across the entire value chain. By circulating products and materials, we can retain embodied emissions. And by regenerating nature, we can sequester more carbon in soil. And the fashion industry has a really important role to play there, both in redesigning the products of the future, but also the services, the systems, the supply chains that will then deliver those products and keep them in use. Ultimately, we need to fix the economy to fix the climate.
What stage is the industry at when it comes to these efforts?
I mean, we're on a journey, right? And when it comes to really quantifying the business case for the exact contributions of the circular economy towards net zero, some of it's been mapped well and some of it is still being mapped. So if we think about things like both on the design and keeping products in use, do you want me to give a few examples briefly? Definitely. Okay, so on the design side, we can think about things like switching to regenerative production of textile fibers on the land. So things like cotton or other natural fibers to help protect and adapt for farmers to ultimately what will be a hotter, wetter climate with more extreme weather events that we can already experience and also expect to experience in a world that's 1.5 degrees warmer, as well as sequestering more of that carbon. And we had a project called the Jeans Redesign, and in that we already saw fabric mills, garment manufacturers and brands working together to try and ready those supply chains for the future. And brands like Reformation already have cellulose-based fibers with proven nature-positive outcomes at the farm level, sequestering more carbon, increasing native vegetative stocks, for example. At the same time, we've been doing research on circular business models, and we can see that if done well, and I will clarify, if done well, because I think we've all seen some of the outcomes to date, but ultimately, if done well, these could represent 23% of the market by 2030. Not only would that be a $700 billion market opportunity, it could provide 1/3 of the emissions reduction necessary to put the fashion industry on a 1.5 degree pathway. And I know some of my colleagues on this panel are already taking action to do that.
Which leads me nicely into talking to some of the panelists about how you're actually putting these things into place. So Nikki, if we could start with you. Tapestry's brands have a number of circularity initiatives. Which ones would you kind of highlight, and can you talk about sort of the impact that these are having on your emissions reduction goals?
Right. So I think just to can you hear me okay? Is it right? Just to quantify, so Tapestry is the holding company of the brands Coach and Kate Spade and Stuart Weitzman. So when I speak, that's some context for you. So on Coach, we already have a repair workshop available for our clients and customers. So if something breaks, they're able to return it. That is repaired, and that extends the lifespan of that product. And then what we did on that is we leveraged the workshops that we have globally to launch the Coach Reloved program, which is essentially a take-back program where gently pre-loved product is repaired or reimagined and then resold online. And then similarly with Kate Spade, we have what we call a sort of an agreement, a partnership with ThreadUp in North America, where they're doing a similar thing, but product is not reimagined necessarily, it's just repaired, cleaned, and sold online. And then from that, we've also launched a sub-brand called Coachtopia. So Coachtopia is essentially a brand where the principles are firmly sort of set in sustainability and circularity. So that's kind of a laboratory for us to experiment with new processes, new ideas, and innovations relative to recycled materials and circular design systems. Then on top of that, to speak to Jules's point earlier, we also have public-facing goals in terms of preferred materials. So we're really actively looking to switch all of our materials into materials with a lower carbon footprint, including sort of the more difficult ones like textile to textile, that's kind of helping to create a demand for those products and also helping to scale for other brands. And then layering on top of that, I think another really important thing to look at is waste. So we are mapping our waste streams, looking at collaborating with other stakeholders, with peers, innovators. We have one of them here today, trying to figure out what we can do to put our waste back into a circular system where we can use it again, or it can be used in another format after that. In terms of the emissions, okay, so there's a couple of challenges here. So I think one of the big challenges we have is that the SBTIs and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the accounting is currently not yet aligned, so something that still needs to be figured out. So that helps us quantify what we're doing. And the other thing is really the lack of a data that's available. So in terms of LCA data, impact data. So when you're doing something new, like for example, using upcycled denim, and we did a collaboration recently with BVH, it's very hard to quantify the positive impact of what that's having in real terms. So if you're calculating your impact with your science-based targets, you're trying to say we're switching from this to this, the data's not there. So you have to go out, do your own LCAs, which is absolutely fine, we're doing that. Collect that data. It takes a lot of time for those of you who've been working on that. But essentially that's part of the process, is you have to really get involved at every level to be able to prove the positive impact of it.
And it is something that, it does need to be proven, but we were talking before, Christian, weren't we, about the fact that it's not only hard to kind of track the impact, but then also you've got to sort of manage up within the organisation and explain why it's so important that you do reduce those emissions and why, therefore, you need to embrace those circular models. Tell us about your approach at Selfridges Group and how the different companies within that group are where they're at on that journey towards circularity.
Yeah, happy to. So Selfridges Group, we are the owner of Selfridges here in the UK. We're the owners of De Bijenkorf in the Netherlands and Brown Thomas in Ireland. We have been interested, involved, engaged in circularity for a while now, and across the three businesses in Europe, we have set targets. So in the UK, Selfridges, we have a 45% transactions target by 2030. And more recently, just a few months ago, De Bijenkorf in the Netherlands have come out with a target saying that by 2030, they want 30% of transactions to be circular. What does circular mean? We realized that there isn't actually sort of a framework necessarily that will tell you as a retailer what is circular? How do you define it? So we put together our own, and we refer to the 5 R's as our circular framework. And the 5 R's are resale, so that would be pre-loved, it would be vintage, it's rental, it's repairs, and because we also sell a lot of beauty products, it's refills. And then lastly, it's any product that contains more than 50% recycled content. And I think it is fair to say that circularity is the closest thing we have to a silver bullet in the fashion industry. We've calculated under different scenarios, so if we get a really high uptake, if we are successful in mainstreaming circular, it could shave off around a quarter of our Scope 3 emissions. And our Scope 3 emissions, as you said, Jules, I guess for every ton of carbon we emit in our stores or our distribution centers, there'll be 11 tons of carbon emitted in our supply chain upstream and downstream. So this is a really big number, 25%. And if you compare that with, you could say, other strategies to reduce Scope 3 emissions, like material substitutions, switching to certified materials, it's actually quite small fish compared to that. So under some of the modeling we've done, even if we switched all our materials, held the volumes at the current level, if we switch to, say, fully organic, recycled, that would only make a dent of around 5% in those Scope 3 emissions. So circular is the big one to go after.
And as I was just saying, we were talking before about the kind of conversations internally about that. How do you communicate internally the importance of embracing the circular models that you're talking about in order to, tackle those Scope 3 emissions, which I think for some organizations are still seen as being one's over here, one's over here?
Yeah, well, obviously that's an ongoing thing. It never stops. It took us a year to develop the ambition, and of course we did it in a very, very inclusive manner, not just talking to our internal stakeholders, but also externally. But I should also say that for those of you working in sustainability or sustainable fashion, you'll know that it sometimes becomes quite it's sort of a negative framing or a negative discussion. Often when you talk about biodiversity, when you talk about climate change, when you talk about human rights, it's always about minimizing something, reducing a risk, sort of lesser or smaller bads in the world. But when it comes to circular, it's growing something, it's a positive agenda. And that kind of framing is really needed if we're to sort of achieve the change we've set out in our ambition. So the buy-in is absolutely phenomenal for circular compared to try and sort of explain a sort of facilities carbon reduction strategy or a biodiversity strategy. This circular gets people engaged across the business, whether they're in commercial roles or not, and that's a mega difference.
And I think we've seen that in the way that Selfridges, for example, has really embraced some of these models. And there was a project last year that was quite kind of consumer facing, that was, having the stock market in the pop-up shop and things like that. And Marine Sarah had a residency, and I think all of that sort of stuff is a really good way of communicating that these circular models can be innovative and a fun, exciting new way of doing fashion retail, as well as also having, these benefits. Nicoletta, coming to you to talk about how Benetton is exploring circularity. I know that there are some of these principles that are in a way kind of baked in terms of how you design. So talk us through that, and then what else are you proactively doing to try and change your model towards one that's a bit more circular?
Thank you, with pleasure. We started our journey in decarbonization last year, formalizing our greenhouse gas emission reduction targets according the Science-Based Target Initiative protocol. We measured our emission, and it was very challenging. And of course, our Scope 3 emissions amounts at almost 97% of our total emissions. So, of course, we focus on those kind of emissions. Our target is to reduce them by 30% by 2030, starting from a 2019 baseline. and our sustainability strategies encompasses several streams that in many cases are interconnected with circularity. We do believe that design is the first step towards circularity because in the designing phase we make decisions that can impact recyclability and physical and emotional durability of our garments. So our collection includes a huge number of we call timeless items. They are essential items intended to be used and reused by our consumers season after season while maintaining their value over time. In addition, a selection of bestseller and basic items will be made available in our store at least within 3 weeks and will not be modified for at least 4 years. In this way, our consumer can find their favorite garments in each moment in our stores while we are managing our production more efficiently, decreasing waste, and with a better control over costs. Another element that we consider strategic is the composition of our garments. So more than half of our collection is made by monomaterial fibers articles, and it means that when they will reach the end of life, they can be recycled more easily. But we do believe that also the engagement of the consumers is strategic, and for this reason we develop an online guide for our consumer that include instruction and video tutorials in order to support them to extend the life of their garments through tips of maintenance or suggestion on how to make simple repairs that can increasingly the life of the use life of our preferred items. So the last step, the last element in which we are focusing our effort is transparency too, because knowing where and how we are producing is not only a let me say, a priority for our consumer, but also a good practice for risk management, and traceability for sure will be a key element with regard to the expecting European legislation from digital product passport to due diligence directive. So this is just an overview. But
yeah, there's a fair onslaught of legislation coming our way, isn't there? But how are you kind of measuring the impact of some of this?
Measuring is very, very challenging. Of course, we are cooperating with the expert on this sector. There are many challenges to address. For example, of course, fashion supply chains are very complex, and so to track all the information about the material flow and the energy use of processes is really difficult to track all the information, and also the availability and the transparency of data, especially primary data, can hinder an accurate quantification of emission reduction. And lastly, doing a very comprehensive life cycle assessment requires the accountability of many variations, and that could also be a challenge for a company because it requires a massive effort of data gathering, and so we are of course focusing our efforts on this topic, but we are just at the beginning of the journey.
How are the other panelists, how are you kind of tackling those challenges when it comes to collecting primary data? And maybe Jules, also you can kind of help us with a bit of an overview.
I mean, data is something we talk about all the time, and I think Nikki mentioned also before about kind of emissions accounting and those frameworks, and one of the projects we're actually working on at the foundation at the moment is how do emissions accounting frameworks like the GHG protocol, for example, actually today account for circular economy efforts or not? And are they able to even take into account that perhaps if emissions go up due to some circular economy choices, but actually are they able to account for the fact that you might be displacing the need for a new product by keeping it in use and things like that? So in mapping that, then determining actually what could or should be good recommendations to actually improve that, and then we'll be publishing a suite of recommendations both for emissions accounting frameworks, climate target setting bodies that almost probably everyone in the room is linked to, and also disclosure frameworks. So we think that is of critical importance. It's something we're working on right now, and it will come out in summer 24. So watch this space.
Oh, fantastic. And in the meantime...
In the meantime, Nikki?
Well, yeah. I mean, in the meantime, so we kind of do two types of things. So we have worked with an external consultant where we have done very specific product and material type LCAs and created our own internal tool called T-Epic, which we use to try to figure out some of that carbon accounting internally. We do work with existing data like the MSI, which has certain challenges as well because the database is not as expanded as it could be. And then we also, as I mentioned earlier, we have to conduct our own LCA data. So where there's a new product, especially when you're working in the leather space, because there's a lot of data available when it comes to textiles, but on the leather side, it's less available. So, things like data on recycled leather and the origin of it, or the type of process that's being used to produce it. When you're recycling resins. So we've got about 6 LCAs that we're working on this year, and that doesn't include the ones we're doing on leather, and that's just to make sure that we can quantify what we're doing and quantify the effort and the money that we're putting into it.
Is that a similar sort of thing for Selfridges Group in terms of the amount of work you're putting into trying to get some of that primary data?
Well, the challenge is certainly comparable, if not bigger. So in any given year, we'll buy from more than 3,000 brands, and we've heard from 2 of the brands just now. So you can add another sort of 2,998 to that. We can only go as fast as the brands can go. So it's a big challenge for a retailer.
Okay. Any further tips for anyone who's on this journey before we move on to talking about what we can get the government involved in in terms of how you're tackling the measurement side of things?
No, nothing.
Just watch the space for EMS.
Well, watch the space, but also keep going. It's so important ultimately, and it's multifaceted and challenging because you're dealing with systems change, and that's okay that you're on the journey.
So one of the things we want to explore is also how we make more of a business case to government to support with this, and on the critical role that circular solutions play when it comes to net zero pathways. So views on kind of what can the government do to set more kind of enabling policies and help to put some of this infrastructure in place. Who wants to jump in with that one? I'm sort of looking at you, Jules, because I feel like...
I can go first and you can jump in. I guess good news stories is after COP28, the circular economy was for the very first time actually written in the formal negotiated outcomes as clearly establishing the link between climate change mitigation and the need for circular economy. That had never happened before. So that is institutionally set in stone, and it is becoming increasingly established for both businesses and policymakers, which is actually really important and fantastic. I don't know how many of you read the small print, but it was a great day. At the same time, and you've already kind of alluded to, there is this wave of legislation coming, especially in Europe, but also beyond. At the fashion industry at the minute, we're thinking about things like circular design. Obviously, you've got ESPR. At the same time, we've got things like EPR, when we think about collection and recirculation of materials, but there's still this gap in the middle, right? If we think about actually what happens in between, namely the way businesses are delivering those products and the way customers are interacting with them. We've heard a lot about circular business models, rental, repair, resale. There is still this gap here, and actually the next 5 years are going to be really critical for both businesses and policymakers to ensure that we can accelerate that and create the policy conditions to enable that to emerge, because otherwise there is a risk that all the amazing effort that is being made to redesign these products to be durable and traceable and recyclable and made with safe materials and processes, which organizations are investing huge amounts of time, energy and money into, where do they go? And ultimately, these pieces of legislation, while fantastic and essential and need to keep going, can become a bit of a band-aid solution if we don't also look at utilization trends, keeping those products in use, and ultimately that will risk slowing progress towards net zero. So great pieces there, but there is a gap in the middle as well that needs to be addressed.
So I think it's also important for, and this is a point that has been brought up actually during the day, it's important for governments to recognize that waste is actually a commodity. It's something that if you go into Asia, they actually fight over waste. You know, they want it because it's something that can become something else. They can earn money off it. And I think it's important for governments here to recognize that it's something that can create jobs. It's something that can create industry. It's something that if they look at the regulations and legislations relative to cross-border movement of waste, that it's something that can become profitable. And it's just to change the mindset and the way that you look at it in a different way. Another thing to think about is that if there are brands or retailers that are actually using recycled materials, is to incentivize that through duty reductions and releases, so that when you're bringing your product in, you're actually getting some kind of benefit, and then that actually compensates for the cost increase.
Does everyone agree that there need to be more of these kind of incentives? Do you feel like the playing field is level at the moment, or does it need to be?
No, absolutely. And we do believe that, voluntary action by brands and retailers and all the other stakeholders are not sufficient. Government should work on incentives like such as tax breaks or grants or other financial incentives, and also work on consistent and coherent regulation that can compel all the stakeholders to adopt a circular solution. So if in one hand, voluntary action could be important, incentives and regulatory legislation could create a level playing field and promote a widespread adoption of circular solutions. So I believe that a mix of all these strategies can be the right way to boost the adoption of circular economy solutions.
Yeah, I don't know about anyone else. If you listen to Brunello Cucinelli earlier, I've started defining my life as the time before Brunello. And then after, it was such a sort of groundbreaking performance, I would call it. But in the run-up to sort of the first half of my life, before listening to Brunello Cucinelli, in some of the panels, I heard the word alignment quite a lot. And I think regulatory alignment is a really big one. Particularly speaking here in London, between the UK and the EU. So that in itself would be really big. And I guess staying in a UK context, arguably sort of the biggest success intervention in terms of a green law or green intervention ever was back in 1996, when the UK government introduced a landfill tax. So all of a sudden it became a lot less lucrative, frankly a lot more expensive, just to sort of dump stuff basically. So since 1996, almost 40 years ago, the amount of waste that's sent to landfill in the UK has reduced by around 60%. So we need a similar thing for the fashion sector. At the moment there's no carrot if you are a sort of carbon light or carbon friendly fashion company or fashion retailer. And on the other side of it, there's no stick, there's no penalty if you are a carbon-intensive fashion company or retailer. So obviously, that needs to be changed.
Last one, because we're running out of time, but we've talked about what governments can do, we've talked about what businesses are doing and can do, and how we can coordinate some action. Let's talk about consumers and the kind of consumer education piece perhaps that's needed, and some of what we've been talking about today is fairly technical. So how do we break that down, bring the consumers on board, and make sure that this is coming, from top down, bottom up? Perhaps Nikki, you could start us off, because I know, for example, with Coachtopia, you've been very transparent about what it's like trying to reverse the supply chain, produce, design from the basis of waste and do things very differently. It's hard. So you've been quite open about that with the consumer, haven't you?
Yeah, so I think I might flip your question a little bit, because so one of the things that's a little bit disheartening when it comes to the consumer, and there's some consumer research that we've done, is that Coachtopia consumer, for example, they still want a new bag every 2 years. Right, they want the sustainable product, but they still want it every 2 years. And then they also want to buy secondhand, but they want to buy 3. So there is this kind of disconnect between what the behavior of the consumer versus what they're asking. So my personal opinion is that you actually have to help the consumer achieve what they don't know they want to achieve yet. So make sure that you're giving them the best materials using your circular design, that they are able to dispose of that product in a sustainable way, be it through an online platform that they can resell it or refurb it and use it again. Just make it easy. Just make it easy for them, because they're not. I think the reality is they're not going to be changing their behaviors in a rush.
No, and so that's none of our fault.
We have to,
there's very much a culture of
So I think we're the
ones
who have the knowledge. We know what we need to do to decarbonize. We know what we need to do to have better materials. We have that knowledge. They don't have that knowledge. So we should be handing it to them on the platter.
It's not about waiting for the consumer to
here
drive
it is. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to hand back over, because I know we've got the workshopping element of this to go, so the conversations are going to carry on. So back over to you, James.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the panel. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much to the panel. Fantastic conversation. And much was solved in that panel, there's still a lot of challenges out there, and that's where you all come in. We're going to now harness the collective intelligence of the Institute for Positive Fashion to solve some of those challenges that we've heard about in that panel. We know it's a great solution. We know circular economy is important. People like it. However, many challenges are there. We heard about data, we heard about regulation, and we heard about many other things. So now it's over to you, and I've got a few instructions, so listen carefully. I know it's the last one of the day, so you know this, but just in case. We're going to have 5 breakout groups, so one here on the red sofa, one there on the dark blue sofa, light blue sofa, green sofa, and red sofa over there. So sort of crowd around into those groups. The 3 through here, we have I think we have a Deloitte colleague on each of those to moderate those sessions. On the other sides, you're on your own, but good luck. I'm sure you're well up to the challenge. So for everyone, as you start, nominate someone who's going to report back at the end. Maybe for those ones, they can also be the facilitator, just to be very convenient. So nominate someone to report back at the end. They're going to take some notes. Don't let them rely on other people's notes. That happened this morning. Someone relied on my notes. My writing's illegible, and it was terrible for everyone concerned. So take some notes. Be ready to report back at the end. We've got 20 minutes to answer the questions. This is the next bit. So what do we need to do? We've heard some examples, but what else can we do to really reduce the impact of our climate impact through circular economy? And also, how are we going to overcome some of these challenges? We've heard there's a lot of challenges here. Panelists here have challenges. They have some solutions as well, but we want to hear from you. How can we overcome some of these challenges to really make this happen at scale? So, groups, facilitator, what can we do, and challenges. Very simple, and we'll report back in 20 minutes. Okay, we'll start over there on the dark red sofa.
Okay, so we covered quite a lot of ground. We started with, just the question of profitability. So circular business models, for businesses that are thinking about this longer term, there's sort of a difference between short term and long term, which I thought was a really good point. That was an excellent point. So how do businesses kind of bake that in longer term with the idea that there might be a dip in profits in some areas, but a longer term gain? We looked at how much uncertainty there is for smaller brands who are kind of wanting to build in this these better practices into their businesses when there isn't as much guidance on how to do that for smaller businesses, or maybe more uncertainty about that kind of hit on profit, more kind of close to the wire. We looked at what kind of support there could be and guidance around, what are the kind of 3 things, if you can only do 3 things in your small business, what do those look like? So I know you guys do a great job of giving guidance, but what can we do to help smaller brands, maybe who are feeling that risk a bit more? So we talked a lot about this. Okay, I think we talked a little bit about education and the need for more education around sustainability and circularity. However, I think we have some educators in our group who said this has been being educated, this is in curriculums at a lot of universities, and it still sort of has this gap between being implemented. So we thought that maybe actually this kind of education for the C-suite, as opposed to graduates that are coming out that don't have the power to sort of influence straight off the bat, there may be a few moves away from being able to do that. So maybe C-suite education around circularity, more of it at least. More guidance, I think I touched on that already. And also I think the last point was just clearer ideas of sort of sustainable business structure. So maybe on the more operations side. So I think brands, we often hear about the great initiatives that are happening that are consumer facing, but what's happening behind the scenes and what do those structures look like internally to make all the different parts of businesses work together to make them more circular.
Brilliant. And could you introduce yourself as well?
Oh, I'm Emily Zach. Yeah, I'm a consultant with Circular Tech.
Brilliant. Thank you. Excellent. Okay, now we'll move on to this group down here. And can you please introduce yourself? Neelam.
I'm Neelam with Deloitte. Just 7 overarching points that I'll do very quickly. So the first one was the need for more tangible evidence around how to actually measure circularity in relation to carbon. We kind of know what that looks like, but the full tangibility of the data and the metric behind it isn't always 100% clear. And then linked to that, some questions around what circularity even really means. So we know the cradle-to-cradle framework exists, but are we actually looking at increasing recycled content by 50%, or is it better to make a choice for 100% natural fiber? And then linking that back to sort of the need for recycling facilities to do that. If those don't exist, what's the point of having recycled content or recycled fibers even being part of it to start? And then in that, the need to think about localized versus global approaches. So if there are recycled facilities, but they're further away, there's definitely a trade-off between the emissions related to transportation and recycling versus not doing it. So really being able to measure the trade-offs around that. Another part of the measurement was around LCAs. We can do as many product level LCAs as we want, but we have a challenge understanding what the service level LCA would even look like in the textile space. And then lastly, the 7th one, the 6th one, there's 2 more, sorry. The 6th one is really around challenges for small and medium-sized enterprises specifically. So even if repair facilities are available and bigger brands have really landed a way to do that at economies of scale, needs for platforms like Sojo and others to continue to facilitate the availability of those facilities for smaller brands who don't have the scale to be able to do repair at the level that they need. And then lastly, really a strong focus on regulation and legislation, things like ESPR, creating level playing fields for brands that are actually doing their best to make choices, whether it's around recycled content or natural fibers, but not being able to compete with brands like that don't do that, and sort of creating a playing field where that would be possible.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, and then on to the next group. I was going to pass that. Do we have someone reporting back? Please introduce yourself, and then a minute to report back. Jules has to get back to the Isle of Wight, and she's going to miss her ferry if we go over.
We just have a ferry to catch, but let's go.
Soz Jules, I'll be quick.
It's all right.
Hi, I'm Sophie Aldridge. I'm from Compare Ethics. We provide AI-powered verification and validation for green claims. Thank you for the plug. So we had a many varied conversation on this huge topic, and we came down on talking about the consumer mainly. So let's focus on the consumer. How can we incite behavioral change? Because if you all change your business models and change the products that you're making, but the consumer doesn't want them, doesn't love them, doesn't reuse them, what's it all for? So many different ideas. We solved it, nailed it. Yeah, so the government should incorporate it into the education system early, start them young. Love the idea of C-suite, universities, all the other ways it's been done. But if you think about how to shape the next generation of consumers, you've got to get into the school system. It should also be on the brands to educate your consumer. I think a lot of you already do that, but beyond educating, enabling them. Can they repair? Do they want to? Do they care? And then thinking about nudge theory, making them a stakeholder. Can you gamify it? And gamify it in a way that's not aimed at more sales for you as the brand, but gamify it as in telling them how much carbon has been saved, or giving them points, or we didn't really delve into the detail of that, but it was a great idea and a great way to get that dopamine hit and that dopamine loop that is causing perhaps more frequent and higher volume purchases of the younger generation that get targeted with the TikTok and the Instagram ads. And then moving on to the onus, being back on the brand for a second, but still linked to consumer, a couple of takeaways from the day, actually. One that I added from you, Sue, where you said, pleasantly surprised them that you're doing it anyway, earlier, which is linked to what the Levi's person mentioned, because we talked about make the consumer buy your product because they love your product, but then the circularity of the product should be an added value. So kind of don't make it the front and center thing, just make great products that happen to be circular.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And to this group, who do you have reporting back? Stay here.
Hi, I'm Sherry Fazal, and my voice carries, so I'm going to put the mic a little farther away because I think everyone can hear. I'm Sherry Fazal, and I'm from Tapestry, along with Nikki up there. We basically, like every other group, we've touched on everything from mindset change of the consumer, the customer, to the education. What we did a little bit different, we went a little bit deeper, so we lost time on the second question, but we went a little bit deeper on the education part, and we talk about the incentive pieces of providing incentive, but also like making it very personalized to the consumer, because telling somebody that this is how much carbon emission, tons of carbon emission you're saving, I don't think resonates, and we don't think resonates. So it's like, how do you tell them the story and how you make it personal to them? We talk about the durability of clothing, like that coming back onto the customer to make things to last, in where the product doesn't go out of style, but the product is the style for all season, as we heard earlier. And then almost, again, in the mindset pieces, we talk about having people treating their clothing almost as like when you buy a house and you know you're going to eventually sell it back. So you don't really throw it around, you take care of it, you cleaned it properly, you do all the right things to make sure you're getting the best value you can at the end, coming back into that. And then the consumer, how do you make it personal to them? I think last year someone on the podium actually gave that example of where the hotel example that we said is that you go into the hotel and they're like, oh, please reuse your towels. But then if you change that sign by just saying, X amount percentage of people that stayed in this room reused their towel, it becomes a little bit more personal and you end up doing that. So we thought those are some of the things that we can continue doing or that people are already doing. And then for the barriers, things like cost, engagement, infrastructure, supply chain, education, instead of thinking of them as barriers, and I'm looking back because the folks here probably can do more justice to explaining this to you. We look at them as opportunity and how we get the consumer engaged in this process in your supply chain, and all of this, space. And one example I can give, for example, Nikki talked about Coachtopia, and one thing that I know that we've done is you invite the Gen Z to come in and look at your waste and tell you, hey, how do you think you want to use this? How do you want it to become a part of the circular economy, and how do you want to see it? Circularity. So it's the idea of looking at things as barriers, I don't think is going to propel us. Is like, look at the barriers, say we acknowledged it, but then how do we flip that on the other side to look at it as opportunities? Like, how do we change that to become opportunities with our consumers?
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And then to the last group.
Thank you. I am Sevda. I am the founder and designer of my handbag company called Sevda London. And for us especially, I want to answer that question from the designer perspective. Also, my friends would agree with me on that topic. Creating a product that we eventually fall in love with is the most crucial and important part of, for me, this circular economy, because eventually you are becoming so emotional attached to that product that it will be shame that you are going to waste it. You want to keep it in your wardrobe for a long time, and you want to have that product be attached and be part of your memories that you are sharing with the family, with your friends. And eventually that product will be so valuable, so beautiful. Doesn't matter if you buy it from high street brand or high-end brand. And the design aesthetic is providing the most essential elements for the circularity, because that product wouldn't go to landfill that easily. It will pass from one hand to another one to another one. It will be protected, and eventually it will be iconic. So this is the, I think, main core principle of circularity. Yeah. Do you wanna add anything? No.
And is that one of your bags?
Yeah, this is one of my handbags.
Very nice,
Thank
very
you.
nice. For those who can't see it, come take a look. It's very
yeah, thank you.
I'm sure people would cherish that.
Thank you.
Great,
So much.
okay, thank you very much. Great, really, really good, and we really appreciate all of this input. We've taken notes, we'll be compiling all of this, and thanks very much for really taking that seriously and getting those great insights out. And now I will just hand back to Kirsty and the panel for some final reflections.
Well, I just wonder if anyone would like to pick out any of the things that you've just heard in terms of anything that resonated or that you would take away from the conversation. I think you've just been volunteered.
That's all right.
I think what I have heard in a number of different stations, I was kind of listening in a little bit, is that brands or bigger brands that have actually done something or have learned something, that it's good for them to share what they have, what their learnings are, and kind of help the smaller brands or the brands that are just getting started scale. And I think I was saying that the EMF has some good you call it?
I'm excited. I'm getting a compliment, but I don't know what it
is. You have good content on that already, but I think like real life learnings and sharing real life learnings it's important to get that out as well. So that will be something I'll feed back to the
That's
ESG
such
team.
an important part of the transparency piece, isn't it? It's not just about meeting regulations, but it's actually about the industry being able to learn from each other, and bigger brands who are facing some of these challenges, as you say, as some of these smaller brands, maybe mid-sized brands, are kind of looking at how to scale up. Well, how do you bake some of those learnings in right from the get-go? Because the benefit that the smaller brands have is that you're much more agile and you can start from a better place, whereas for bigger brands often you're trying to row back on years and years in a very, very large complex supply chain and trying to change things, which takes a lot longer. So it's that kind of learning from each other, isn't it?
Yeah. I think another thing's been interesting, obviously a lot of conversation about the customer, what's the role of customer, what's the role of businesses or governments in that. And I think there is also an element that many organizations have marketing and communications powerhouses, right, that are creative and imaginative and have built culture and trends. And ultimately, I think there's something really interesting in the provocation of how can you take those effective, like, powerhouses of the linear economy and then give them the creative challenge to then apply all those skills to actually perpetuating the circular economy instead. It's not about saying you can't do your job anymore. It's about saying, can we use all that talent but put it towards something else? That's one of the ones I wanted to leave with.
I love that, and that really resonates with what different people were saying around the emotional connection you need to have in creating products that people love, regardless of how it's made. In a way, that becomes a secondary consideration, and even the gamification side of things that you guys were talking about. It's all about that emotional connection with the consumer. On this side, anything that you would take away?
Well, first of all, thank you for all these reflection inputs. I take away they are very valuable. And just to reflection about small, medium company, any company can reach these huge targets alone. So my suggestion is to join industry collective action where we can share best practices, data, methodologies, and also challenges. And the other reflection is about the emotional durability of the items, because I think that is a really key strategic point in the changing of the behavior of consumers. If we love really deeply our garments, well, we don't throw them away. We will love to repair and to keep them lasting longer. So yeah, I thank you for.
Thanks, Nicoletta. And Christian, final thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to say thank you too. I want to say thank you to you, Kirsty, for moderating what was a complex discussion. Thank you for the super helpful feedback, insights. Thank you to Brunello, if you're still out there. I think one of the key points that was mentioned was about long-termism, that circular at the moment doesn't necessarily fit neatly into sort of traditional financial metrics, or at least it doesn't compare as well on things like margin or profitability. But we shouldn't forget that we've spent the last 20, 30, 40 years building a well-oiled fashion machine that is linear, and it'll take a long time to change that. And that change is not going to go sort of 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%. Just like, like people started using smartphones because their friends used smartphones. It's not fun being the only person in town with an electric vehicle. There will be inflection points where all of a sudden sort of the floodgates open. So I think we all need to be patient. We can't apply sort of to the same degree we do to linear business, the same financial metrics, but we will get there. Whether that's in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, or 10 years' time, I don't think anyone can say that. But I think everyone in this room would hopefully agree that's where we're going.
Interesting, the smartphone analogy, because I think technology will be one of the things that really unlocks some of those inflection points. But that's probably for another day in another workshop. So I will hand back over.